Hello world! Patricia, O'Connor, and Frida, Reba, Darcy here today. Let me see if I can get my butt settled. Today, on the bonsai balcony, we are going to talk about Ponderosa pines. We are, Frida, Ponderosa pines. I've had a couple. Right now, this is a pair of Ponderosas, and they both came from the same collector. I did have a large literati Ponderosa. We lost it last winter. Just the way it goes. Sometimes you win, sometimes you lose. I really loved that tree too, but that hasn't really dampened my spirit about having these really nice trees. They are pines that grow around the Rockies and higher. They're a higher elevation pine. They are a single flush pine, and the way to bring them about and bring out the best in them, and to do them well for bonsai is a little different than some of the things that we've been discussing, and you will have seen the other videos here lately discussing when it comes to Japanese black pines. Like right now, whatever age this video is, whatever time you happen to be seeing it, right now in the Bay Area, it is late, mid-late June, and we're on our black pines looking rolling or right in the middle or right in some progress thereof of candle cutting season. That's not really our issue when it comes to these single flush babies that you see here. This tree is kind of a literati windswept. I would say it's a windswept literati. It's 26 years old. It was collected, and it was collected in Deadwood, South Dakota, at an elevation of like 6,000 feet or something. It was pretty high up there. And this other one was from the same region, from the same area, and is about 20 years old. Which is to say that when you get to know the characteristics of a tree, you can tell the characteristics of a tree if it's in infancy, if it's in adolescence, if it's in its teenage years, and if it's in its adult years, and then if it's in its senior years. Those all have characteristics, and to that end, or maybe because they ginned this branch themselves and counted rings or something, but for whatever reason, this tree came with a very specific age, that it was 26 years old, and it was collected as a Yamadori. Kind of going into this story because of a story that was repeated to me in the teachings that I picked up from watching other teachers and subscription channels and some pretty famous teachers and instructors. One story comes around where you maybe find a Ponderosa in the wild, and maybe it is stunted, naturally stunted because of the way nature had provided for it. It's gotten too much sun with too little water, with too much wind and snow, and just being pounded every way. And so now you've got this beautiful bonsai here with needles that are small, and you think, wow, this thing has small needles. It's a freak of nature. I'm going to collect this tree and bring it back, and I'll have this twisted, aged, naturally made Yamadori with naturally small needles. It must be a hybrid or some weird cross or something. So you collect the tree, you take it home, you do your conversion well, and if the tree thrives the following season, it flushes out with new growth, and the stuff is as long as hell. What was happening there is it had gotten too little water and too little everything and too much of other things, and that had naturally stunted the growth of the tree, but that had also stunted that 1 foot in death's door. That also kind of stunted its ability to to grow long, healthy needles. So as soon as the tree gets enough water, enough fertilizer, and the right amount of light, and it becomes a healthy tree, it begins to make the needles that you would have expected to see if you were looking at a species of tree that typically makes long needles. You didn't find a miracle bush. You just found a tree that was so undernourished it couldn't make needles as long as it would have normally wanted. So this is kind of a good place to start. You can see the needles. I love this little tree, by the way. But you can really see the needles here on this guy. They're quite long. Given the size of the tree, the needles are half the length of the tree. That's disproportionately long to give us the illusion of a miniature tree. But that's also by design. As soon as I took possession of the tree, the first thing I started doing was feeding it. Whereas on my Japanese black pines in June, beginning of June, I will have picked up all of my fertilizer from the base of the black pines because they need to start running on what fertilizer they've already started breaking down, and they need to start running that through their system so that when I come through and candle cut, they won't have an abundance of energy to make a second round of long needles, and they'll just instinctively make short ones. That's not how we do these. This is a longer process, but it starts off in an opposite direction to begin with. They may have had short needles when they were collected because that's what life did to them by kicking their butts. And as soon as they get an adequate amount of water, as soon as they get, now I have to also say an adequate amount of water doesn't mean too much. These guys take less water. Ponderosas take less water than Japanese black pines, who I had to learn to water. But at the same time, they're in bonsai pots. This guy in the summer still gets watered about once a day. Its giant counterpart might get watered twice a week. You know, it was in a pot this big, it might have gotten watered twice a week, and it would get watered that frequently because it had no taproot. If it still had a taproot, that would have been overwatering the tree. As it stands, I lost a tree during a wet period, but I'm not going to say that was probably what killed it. I think it's probably the rule of threes or something. It came to me with the sniffles over some bad shipping, and every time it pushed out new growth, I felt a little bit more relieved, but I never quite felt out of the woods with that tree over that initial issue. And to that end, we ultimately lost that tree. So, but that's neither here nor there. So the minute I got these guys, the first thing I did was started feeding them. And what we do is you see a tree that goes from being maybe a little sparse, and maybe the needles are kind of naturally short, and as soon as it gets an adequate amount of water, an adequate amount of nutrients, and I give these guys BioGold, which is 555. Those are all single digits. That kind of keeps me from overfeeding them. It also keeps me from creating problems with feed them, like stretching, you know, like all of a sudden one part of the trunk just grew a mile long, and you're like, wow, there's nothing to fix that except cutting the tree in half. So kind of a thing. But what I do with the BioGold is I've removed it for the video for the most part, but what you basically do is take these lumps. There's still some here on these, but you take these lumps and you put them down, and then you let them break down. And this area here is where all of that is where all of the BioGold is breaking down. And it can stain your tree if you're not careful. That's why a lot of people will use tea bags or those little plastic balls. Those little, almost look like plastic golf balls or something on top of people's substrate. It's their pellets, their fertilizer pellets are inside there. So once you start feeding it, the first thing you'll notice is that it will start making needles that are more like a longleaf pine. Loblollies do the same thing when it comes to just making really, really long needles. That's a sign that it's a healthy, happy tree. Now, what happens, what we want to do with these is rather than cut candles, we're not really ever going to be into that. We're never going to go through and cut the candles on this guy the way we do our other pines, especially our black pines or our red pines. But what we're going to do instead is the opposite. We're going to feed this. We just got it. The needles were shorter than this when I got the tree, but a little long because it's a Ponderosa. But they were shorter than this. So the first thing I started doing was I repotted the tree because I didn't trust the pot that it was in, and also restyled it when I was repotting it. I'm pretty happy with all of that, and I changed the angle drastically, which I'm also pretty happy with that, and I put some more motion in its limbs. But from just at the get-go, I started feeding this tree, and I started measuring its water intake to see how much it needed. Ponderosas will do something. Well, they will change their look when they are thirsty. Their needles can shut off their pores and try to retain what water it has left, and that actually changes the look of it. If you look at it, you think your Ponderosa looks different today than it did yesterday, but you can't quite put your finger on it. Maybe the color seems slightly, more pastel and less waxy or something. It's closed up its pores and it's locked in its moisture because it's holding on to what it has left. Water it and watch that change in a few hours if it's dry. If you see that and it's not dry, it could be something else. But I was just noticing, like the other day, I saw this one and went, wow, that's noticeably, I wouldn't say it was yellow, it was kind of gray. That wasn't quite right either, but that was kind of the way I would lean towards. And then I watered and took good care of that. Also, you can see where I've had a few troubles with this tree at one point. The angle I planted it at, I absolutely love it. I think it's gorgeous this way, but also it's big, it's long, and you can see I've got needle damage on the end. We're at the part of the summer where the needles are starting to have a little bit of age to them. The older needles the long needles are starting to have a little bit of age to them, and they're starting to show the damage that either I've done or other trees have done by rocking into it. By having them in too tight of a quarter, because I've got this guy all spread out, means that it's probably poking something, or I'm poking it, or it's poking me when I'm reaching for other things. And you don't necessarily see that at the time, but then when the needles start to age a little bit, the things you've done to them begin to really show their ugly heads. And to that end, I'm looking at the needle damage here. But otherwise, the tree is healthy and is doing well and is pushing out new stuff. It got a repot this year as well. I up-potted it some, giving it a little bit more room and changed its angle. But just to get back to what we were discussing, feeding them and giving them enough water to flourish is kind of the opposite to the way old bonsai rules were that would say hold back on everything and shrink it. It's like some of the bonsai masters would go an amount of time in between waterings on Japanese black pines and stuff that would absolutely give me the creeps, but they kept their trees proportions by just holding back everything and kind of keeping it like 1 foot in that grave or whatever. So this is the opposite. We feed it, we water it. What is the end result of that? It makes long needles and back buds profusely and gets more healthy. So what do we do then? We continue to feed it, and it responds by back budding more, and now it's making even more needles. So now it's making more and more and more, longer and longer needles, and it's making all of that energy, and it's throwing it back into the tree, and all of a sudden we've elevated the health of our tree, but at the length of our needles. These new needles that are coming in now are much longer than the ones that were on the tree when I got it, and that's by design. That's all my feeding. It wasn't because I repotted it, but it did get up potted a little, so that may have helped. But it was because of the feeding. All of a sudden it got a feeding routine that was a little different than the one that it was used to. Up until now, it spent all of its time at the collector in the same 12-mile area from which it was born. So it was kind of like you just continue to grow it like it was growing last week when it was still in the rocks, and that's how you do that. Here we do it a little differently because we're not where it used to live, and we have to figure out what that was and simulate it and accommodate it as much as we can, and then account for it when we can. So what that means is now that this thing has started making a lot of needles and a lot of really long needles, we're just getting started. This is not this year thing. Next year we'll continue to feed it. We'll continue to do exactly what I said. We will have never taken it off of a no food program. Our Japanese black pines will go, the ones that we needle, the ones that we cut the candles on, they stop getting fed now or at the beginning of June, and they won't get fed again until fall. These guys, round the year, round the clock. Kind of like our seedlings in other pine species, we just feed them around the clock too because they're still they need to grow stuff. So, and that just, when it finally has produced a lot more needles and they're away a lot more longer, it will have said, I have this amount of roots, but I now have this much more needles and they're this long. I can't keep this up. Unless you up-pot me, there's no way I can continue to make this many needles this long. So next year, unless you do something to help this situation, the tree is going to decide, or it's not really going to decide, it's going to have no choice but to start making its next round of needles shorter. And it's done so because it's got so many back buds and so many needles, it can't pass around the same amount of nourishment that is derived from its amount of roots in this restrained pot to pass around and make that many needles that long continuously. Once it's started off of its reserve and it's just going on what it's making now, we can't continue to keep that up. At that point, the tree starts making smaller needles, but it's still a healthy tree. We never stopped feeding it. It just kind of started accommodating what it had with the resources that it now had to allocate to all those more needles. It's at that point that we can go and start trimming back our ends. We can start cutting back the tree that was allowed to maybe elongate, because up until now, if we remove needles, if we cut branches, if we cut our tips and do all that stuff, it's going against the process. What we want to do is make, I'm reluctant. You see people who are doing this and they're reluctant to clean up the needles on the bottom because it's all about a higher needle count, which will in the end reduce the amount of energy it can allocate per needle because there's just too many of them. And a couple of years of that, of treating it really well and giving it everything it wants, and finally it's like, yeah, but I can't make these needles this long anymore. From now on, they're just going to be shorter. And we're going to go, that's fine with us. Continue to be healthy. And I'm going to prune your end back a little bit because you're looking a little long and leggy for a bonsai tree. And once you do that, you're doing that with a tree that's already making smaller needles, and you're off to the races. And that's basically the process of trying to keep needles shorter on a single flush Ponderosa pine. There are some other trees for which you could use this same technique. These are Ponderosa Scopulorum, which is a easier version of Ponderosa to bonsai. There are other sub-varieties of Ponderosa that are not as easy, but they have beautiful, beautiful characteristics. They bend easier. They bend easier than I thought going in. I looked at a hard piece of wood and went, I'm not going to be able to bend that without it snapping. And I sure enough was. And also they're hard. They're hard to bend, but you can do cool things and twists with them. And these branches and stuff lend themselves to movement. These branches, even though they've got lichens on them and are years old, they lend themselves well to twist and flows and ribbon type movement and stuff, and it's really enjoyable to see. Also, they make a beautiful bark, and sometimes it almost takes a pattern. The bark will actually look kind of patterny, like reptile scales or something, without being overly contrived about it. They just kind of naturally have that look about them in a way that's slightly reminiscent. I think it would lend itself well to my curly cues. I'm thinking that maybe here in not too long, we might have to just order up a dozen Ponderosa seedlings and see how they take to my Cheerio bending style. But they're really enjoyable trees to grow. Another tree would be a Jeffrey, very, very close cousin to the Ponderosa, and you would also likely see them growing in very close proximity to one another, and it can be difficult to tell one from another. They look so similar, but there are couple of things. One, the sap on a Ponderosa pine smells like butterscotch. It's absolutely delicious to smell. And two, the pine cones are different. On a Ponderosa pine, if you take one of its pine cones and you set it in your hand, the barbs on the edge of the I'm gonna say petals of a pine cone. I don't know the real word. Have little barbs on them, and on a Ponderosa, those will actually sticky. You know, they're not gonna kill you, but you can kind of feel that they're little sharp things that sit in there, needle-like. And on a Jeffrey, they're pointed out on the bottom, and it just kind of sits there in your hand, and you're supposed to think of that as Gentleman Jeffrey's Painful Ponderosa. Maybe, I don't remember exactly how, but I do remember the Jeffries was the gentleman of the two when it came to holding the pine cones, and the other thing that was a quick tell was that butterscotch smell whenever you pick a needle or scratch a branch or just smell the sap coming in. That's a quick rundown of Ponderosas. They grow very, 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 very slow. They move very, very, very slow. The metabolism of the tree is much slower than what you might be used to. They do take to grafting. You can graft a Japanese black pine to Ponderosa growing stock. The roots are absolutely would never miss a hit. They're probably over-engineered for Japanese black pine. And at that point, if you had a Ponderosa and you had exchanged your foliage with different foliage from a different pine, you would then grow it like that foliage that you grafted onto it. You would then grow it like a black pine. There are regions of the world, or in America, for instance, where these don't do as well. If it doesn't get cold enough, they need a certain amount of cold to shut off and take a break, or they just run themselves into the ground and you have a healthy tree for a couple of years and then it dies. I'm on the cusp of that. The jury is not 100% out whether or not I can even grow these, but the one that I lost, I got on exactly the same day that I have this smaller one, and I've always been able, it's always done much better than the larger one that passed away on us. And this one seems to have thrived in the amount of time that we got here. Our biggest danger so far was the amount of rain we had gotten. The big tree, I wasn't able to find much space on the balcony from where it was actually out of the weather. It just kept getting watered whether I wanted it to or not, and I didn't want to bring it in the house because that's also a big no for trees, outdoor trees. So that ended up being the final nail in that coffin. But in short, too late to be in short, but I think Ponderosas are really rewarding to grow. I've really enjoyed the three that I've had so far, and I am looking forward to getting more of them. I'm not at all. I got this one to replace the one that I lost. So far from being over it, I went back and got one that I could style a little bit more and work a little bit more on. The last one, the one that I lost, was a finished Literati Yamadori, 175 years old. So yeah, ouch. But when I replaced it with this one gave me a chance to do some wiring, do some bending, do some reshaping, change the angle, repot it, and feeding it is absolutely just and those needles are as long as Siamese cat whiskers. But that is exactly what we wanted to do for the next couple of years, and we're just going, hey, welcome to the Ponderosa there, Ponderosa, and we're just going to feed and take a little bit of care of these guys until they start making smaller needles, and then we'll let it do that for a little while, and then start cutting some of that older long needle stuff back to a usable length. And that's how you do Ponderosas. Thank you so much for watching. I appreciate you. Frida appreciates you. We'll probably do another drop tonight. I love to make use of the balcony and a little less run and gun when I set up on a nice day and just kind of sit underneath the cypress trees. But it sure has been enjoyable to do these. But I'll probably go and put something on the bench tonight. We'll work with that. I've got a little bit of pine tree work ahead of us, and I am looking forward to seeing maybe 10 little Ponderosas, and we can go. I think that wiring stuff that I did with the Japanese black pines last fall, that was a lot of fun, and y'all seem to like it too. I'm thinking that I'm looking forward to doing more of that, and I'm also going, well, you know, when they start making bark and stuff, I bet those Ponderosas would really look well if they were just all twisted and curled and python looking, you know. Anyway, like and subscribe if you guys haven't already. We will probably do another drop tonight. This one will probably drop the day of. This is our Saturday drop. Saturday underneath the cypress, I guess is kind of what this is. But we're talking pondos at the Hondo. Thank you so much for watching.